It's time now for the news review of this bulletin. China slams Washington for spreading disinformation and says the U.S. is the world's biggest disseminator of false information.
The more lies the U.S. government tell, the more its reputation deficits will be. The U.S. should stop fabricating and spreading false information and no longer be proud as being an empire of lies.
The Foreign Ministry spokesman made the remarks after the U.S. Department of Homeland Security paused the work of a body called the Disinformation Governance Board. It was put on hold 3 weeks after being established amid serious questions about its function and purpose. Zhao responded to this by saying the board deserves to be questioned because ordinary people are falling victim to its falsehood. Many of its opponents, including Senator Mitt Romney, claim the Disinformation Governance Board spreads propaganda and limits freedom of speech. Frank Emspak, Emeritus Professor, University of Wisconsin-Madison, joins us. And we also have with us E. Michael Jones, editor at Culture Wars magazine from South Bend, Indiana. Welcome to you both. Frank Emspak, tell us what this Disinformation Governance Board, why it was formed, what its purpose was, and why it's put on pause.
Well, I wish I knew. You know, here is one of these bizarre things that happens in American media, where you have a board, I guess, formed, and it's theoretically it's going to pronounce on different parts of disinformation and say this is not true and should be taken off of this or that internet provider. On the other hand, the internet, while it's a public utility in a certain sense, the providers are private. Facebook is a private company. Amazon are private companies. And so there is really nothing in American law that would provide you or somebody to say you can't do this, because then people say, well, it's a free speech issue. But in the United States, free speech means free speech if you have the money. I ran a news organization for 12 years. I know very, very intimately about how that aspect works. So, in fact, you have Elon Musk saying he's going to go buy Twitter or whatever, and he's going to put President Trump back on, or former President Trump back on, because he doesn't believe you should have, restrictions on free speech. So this whole thing is, and I just think, bizarre. There is no way that a disinformation board, no matter who sets it up, can actually intervene and say, you cannot do this, and have that stand up constitutionally. And I suspect what happened here is you have this cross currents between being people who are really worried about the disinformation on Fox, which is fundamentally calling into question the legitimacy of the United States government, period. That's what they're doing. And it has been working, using disinformation and craziness. Why the Chinese suddenly got involved, I don't understand, because the United States has been going after the Chinese now for about 10 months, or maybe even longer, in terms of the Biden administration, making them to be the boogeyman of the new century, you know. So why they reacted to this particular thing, I have no idea.
Well, Ian Michael Jones, when you take a look at the purpose of this and the country that it emanates from, the U.S., to form this, it puts into question why that would be and what function it would serve, and for whom is this conceived in order to make sure that this information is not spread. What are your views on this? How do you assess this?
I think it's basically the government's getting involved in what now has come to be known as fact check. Anytime you log on now and there's some type of news outlet, on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll have this thing called fact check. Fact check is basically the oligarch media's attempt to bring the population back under thought control. This broke down over the last few years on the internet, when basically significant numbers of people checked out of the mainstream media. The crucial element, I think, was the COVID pandemic, where pretty much your life was on the line. If you took the vaccine, there was a serious chance of getting vaccine injury. People knew that, and they were looking for alternative forms of medicine, and they found things like ivermectin. Well, as soon as they found that, the oligarchs decided, no, we're going to shut these people down. We're going to ban you from the internet if you look for or if you give information about medicine that we don't like. I think that this disinformation government operation flowed directly from that failure to control the internet. This is the government promoting a fact check operation. This is a government fact check. The problem here is our previous contributor just said, is the government is limited here because of the First Amendment. This has been the great genius of the internet and things like Google. Google has the power of government, has no responsibility whatsoever to the people. It can do whatever it damn well pleases. It can ban you. You have no recourse because it's the best of both worlds. It's the power of government without any responsibility of the government. And the government made a mistake here, Homeland Security, because they have to do something to justify the money. They decided they were going to become fact checkers. Well, they can't because they're the government. So there was just a mistake on their part.
All right, let's listen to what people thought about this online, and we'll get back to our conversation. First post, no one believes in boasting and lies now. U.S. facing lots of problems that Biden administration failed to fix. From Afghanistan, Middle East, now the Russians. All nations are now becoming enemies of the U.S., including the most favorable nation, China, possibly India. Next post, the USA spent hundreds of millions just to pump out false information about China and teamed up with Nazis in Ukraine to start a proxy war against Russia. You know what's coming. Next, the Disinformation Governance Board under the Department of Homeland Security was halted just 21 days after it was set up. The U.S. governing disinformation is a tool for inter-party rivalry. The political credibility of the U.S., an empire of lies, have long gone bankrupt. And a final post. Facts have proven that the U.S. is the largest disseminator of false information, the perpetrator of coercive diplomacy, and the destroyer of world peace and stability. All right, when you take a look at two of these Frank Anspach posts that we just read off from the viewers, what is in common here, one of the facts, is the fact that you're looking at how the U.S. and through various organizations, whether online, media, what have you, actually is a spreader of disinformation or inaccurate information to a large degree. Using that, why would the Department of Homeland Security be allocated to do what you have said, or what E. Michael Jones said, is basically a fact-checking, which doesn't work when it's government-related?
It doesn't work at all. The problem that the mainstream or the legitimate United States government has at the moment, a problem, is that a substantial proportion of the population is questioning its legitimacy. Now, this is extraordinarily dangerous and destabilizing to this society, about the society as a whole. And so, the bureaucratic reaction was this fact-check operation, which isn't going to accomplish anything because the people, in our case, that Trump won the election are not going to be swayed by having somebody say, well, Fox News is wrong on this, this, and this, and this. So to me, this is just lunacy that you'd have something like something and deal with the legitimacy of the government. Then you have to deal with that. You have to talk about how the government is structured, democratic reforms, who is excluded, and the government serving people, as opposed to talking about else. And I think about disinformation and media, and we take a look at the war in Ukraine. I mean, really, let me just give you just one example, okay? The Americans were in Vietnam. There were several hundred there for quite a period of time. Now, what would happen if we use the same standard in this country as the Ukrainians just did with the Russians, that a Russian soldier killed somebody who was unarmed? Goodness, just don't, the whole thing is skewed in such a way that it's really very, very difficult, if not impossible, to really disentangle this disinformation business. The United States is an expert at this from World War I.
Mm-hmm. Well, E. Michael Jones, quickly, if you can answer this, how does this apply to the foreign policy arena when the U.S. has spread disinformation, if you want to call it that, about various countries? We're talking from a country that has been on the receiving end of U.S. disinformation, and that's the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Yeah, well, the CIA called this operation the Mighty Wurlitzer, which is an organ that used to be played in theaters, and they said that they could play the media throughout the world like an organ. Well, they've been doing that for years, and for the most part, everyone believed what they were doing. Time magazine was the propaganda ministry of the United States of America, but nobody saw it that way. Well, that's all broken down. And what really started with COVID has accelerated with the coverage of the Ukraine. This is preposterous, completely preposterous, the type of propaganda we're getting that's masquerading as news. And then they're going to talk, the government's going to talk about disinformation. That's ridiculous. They've lost control of the narrative.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you, E. Michael Jones, editor at Culture Wars magazine from South Bend, Indiana. I'm from Madison, Frank Emspach, Emeritus Professor, University of Wisconsin. Thank you. And with that, we come to an end for this news review.